Today, we're diving into a really provocative question raised by naturopathic doctor Amanda King. In the massive, multi-billion-dollar fight against cancer, are we overlooking some of the most effective and affordable treatments just because they can't be patented? Let's get into the arguments laid out in her article. All right, so here's our roadmap. First, we're going to challenge the very idea of what causes cancer. Then, we'll follow the money and look at the economics. After that, we'll explore the wild potential of some really common medicines, tackle that infamous horse dewormer controversy, and wrap up with a look at what a more integrated future for cancer care could look like. So, let's start at the very beginning. The source kicks things off by questioning the absolute foundation of modern oncology, the main theory of what cancer even is. And this is the big question, right? It suggests that for decades, the entire cancer research industry might have been building on a model that, well, that isn't telling us the whole story. Okay, so the article lays out two competing ideas. On the left, you've got the conventional view, the somatic mutation theory. The idea here is that cancer is a genetic disease. It's all about faulty DNA. This is why you hear about things like the BRCA gene. But on the right, you have the challenger, the mitochondrial metabolic theory. This one argues cancer is mainly a metabolic disease, and the problem isn't the genes themselves, but the damaged mitochondria, the little powerhouses inside our cell. To back this up, the source points to this really critical experiment. Get this, scientists took the nucleus from a cancerous cell, the part with all the bad DNA, and put it into a healthy cell. And guess what? It did not become cancerous. But when they did the reverse, putting a healthy nucleus into a cell with broken mitochondria, it did become cancerous. The takeaway from this, according to the article, it might be the cell's environment, its engine, that's the real driver, not just the genetic blueprint. And this leads us to the quote that just sums it all up. If this metabolic theory is right, are the billions and billions of dollars spent targeting genes barking up the completely wrong tree? That is a heavy question. And a heavy question like that leads right to the economics of it all. The source argues that if you really want to understand cancer treatment, you have got to follow the money. The article highlights this pretty startling statistic from a study back in 2004. It found that, on average, chemo contributed just 2.3% to 5-year survival rates for adults. Now, the author is super clear. This is not about telling people to stop chemo. It's about asking some really tough questions about its cost versus its benefit. So this makes you wonder, right? If one of our main treatments offers, in this analysis, a pretty small improvement for many, why isn't there a massive push for totally different ideas? The article suggests the answer is all about the economics. And here's the core argument in a nutshell. The problem isn't a lack of good ideas, it's a lack of profitability. Brand new, patentable drugs are huge business. But what about a potential treatment that's already a cheap, generic drug? Well, according to the author, if you can't patent it, you can't profit from it. And if there's no profit, there's no money for the huge clinical trials needed to make it a standard of care. So, this brings us to what the article proposes as a solution, taking old existing drugs and giving them a brand new purpose. So, what are we talking about here? Repurposed drugs are basically medications that are already FDA approved for one thing, say diabetes or high cholesterol, but then scientists discover they have these secondary effects that can fight cancer. And the best part? They're usually off patent, which means they're often incredibly cheap. You'll probably recognize some of these names. Metformin, a super common diabetes drug, can mess with cancer's metabolic pathways. Good old aspirin can act as a powerful anti-inflammatory. Atorstatin for cholesterol can also block key pathways that cancer uses. The source claims there could be thousands of drugs like these just hiding in plain sight. Let's look at one specific example the article dives into, fenbendazole. It's an anti-parasitic drug. Okay, so the way it kills worms is by stopping them from building these internal structures called microtubules. Well, it turns out that cancer cells need those exact same structures to divide and grow. So fenbendazole basically throws a wrench in the cancer cell's whole replication machine. And this, of course, brings us to a drug that became just unbelievably controversial, ivermectin. The source dives right into this public perception battle. So, how is ivermectin supposed to work against cancer, according to the article? Well, one of the biggest problems in cancer treatment is when cancer becomes resistant to drugs. It does this by creating these tiny pumps that literally kick the chemo drugs out of the cell. The article claims ivermectin can block these pumps, essentially trapping the chemo inside the cancer cell so it can do its job better. But any potential use for cancer ran smack into this massive public relations campaign against using the drug off-label. This quote from the FDA became famous, and it pretty much cemented the idea in the public mind that this was only a veterinary medicine. But, and this is a big but, the article points out a follow-up that almost nobody heard about. A group of doctors actually sued the FDA over this messaging, and they won. The source notes that the FDA had to take down those posts, but by then, the damage to its public perception was pretty much done. So where does all this leave us? Well, the last part of the article paints a picture of what an integrated future could be, where these different ways of thinking aren't at war with each other, but actually work together. This approach isn't about choosing one or the other. It's about using the entire toolbox. According to the source, that means using things like nutrition to make the body a place where cancer can't thrive, using repurposed drugs to make standard treatments work better at lower doses, and, this is crucial, supporting the whole person, mind and body. And the source makes this really fascinating point. A lot of the people who are pushing these new ideas came from way outside the medical establishment. They weren't famous oncologists. They were people with fresh eyes who weren't stuck in conventional thinking. And that really leaves us with the article's final big question. What if, when you got a diagnosis, you didn't just get a plan for chemo and radiation? What if you got a whole roadmap that included nutrition, supplements, and repurposed drugs too? It's a really powerful vision of what the future of cancer treatment could be.